Paramount Pictures released an epic 1923 silent movie entitled The Covered Wagon, which is an example of a film entertaining audiences with pioneers slaughtering Indians and bison. The Covered Wagon was adapted from the best-selling novel by Emerson Hough, and is about two groups of wagon train travelers who experienced hot summer heat, winter snow, and conflicts with Native Americans while trekking between Kansas and Oregon. What if The Covered Wagon was retold from a tribal perspective, about how the Arapaho are renewing their way of life by teaching their children the Arapaho language and the tribal culture? The Arapaho Covered Wagon Redux, through a new soundtrack, reverses racism toward Native Americans by emphasizing a contemporary tribal presence within non-tribal communities. Tribal elders link those efforts with the repatriation of their traditional homeland that will result in a cultural pipeline from Wyoming, through Colorado, to Oklahoma. Several Arapaho tribal members expressed their perspectives about the results of tribal stereotypes that have resulted in oppressive government policies and forced assimilation.
With his faithful Indian companion Tonto, the daring and resourceful masked rider of the plains led the fight for law and order in the early West.
Gary Collins is formerly the Arapaho tribal liaison with the state of Wyoming.
There's been a generation of us that have challenged many rules that have discriminated against the tribal membership. It's basically been a strong effort to marginalize the native populations.
Devin Oldman was the tribe's historic preservation officer.
Stereotypes for Native Americans, they're still very pertinent, right? Some people still believe we live in teepees, some people still, they think that there's nothing but drunks and women beaters on the reservation, the dark history of America, they think that, our people are ignorant.
If you can understand what it was like coming out of World War II, when the Eisenhower administration was prone to eliminating all reservations, and so there was a real surge to diminish native populations.
In 1956, the U.S. Congress established a new policy toward Native Americans that eliminated government support for tribes and ended trust status of tribal lands. The Bureau of Indian Affairs began a voluntary urban relocation program. This was yet another step towards stripping tribal members of their identity. The BIA produced recruitment films that painted a very rosy picture of urban life.
The streets that once bewildered him are no longer confusing. He has begun to feel at home upon them. He has learned that Chicago's fast public transportation system is more convenient than his own car.
The realities of the big city weren't always how they were presented.
What they did this time was try and convince us that there was great opportunities waiting for Indians in the cities. More than half of us believed it. In the ghetto, nothing ever really worked. Plumbing, the heat, everything was always broken down.
While some tribal members successfully adapted to urban living, others faced unemployment, discrimination, and loss of tribal cultural support.
The BIA, has unraveled the fabric of the community.
William C. Hare is the chair of the Northern Arapaho Language and Culture Commission.
In order to move more rapidly and advance further, therefore that's when he started this system of annihilating these four that were impeding their progress. Indians, they started to be attacked just whenever and however, shot on sight. And also the grizzly bear, the wolf, and the buffalo. Over 600 years of contact not one Indian has turned white.
When the film opened in New York City at the Criterion Theater and at Sid Grauman's Egyptian Theater in Hollywood, a live orchestra performed the Hugo Riesenfeld soundtrack. He was a pioneer in silent film score composition and later for talkies. According to University of Wyoming music professor and Gutso, the soundtracks performed for silent movies were compilations of existing music.
So the principle of silent movie music in that case was basically mood music. They would have these giant books of piano music and organ music called mood music, and there'd be a tab on the right side, and you would look and you'd be like, okay, for scenes of impending doom, and then you'd turn the page and there'd be your drama music for impending doom.
One way to unravel tribal stereotyping in movies is through the soundtrack.
Originally, the music was to cover up the changing of the reels. So if you had a long movie, you had to keep changing the film reels over and over again, and then some pianist would play in between. And it was also to cover up the whirring of the machines and to give it sort of this realistic emotional tug and pull.
What if a contemporary score was compiled with a tribal influence provided by traditional Arapaho drummers and singers?
And I also tried to put the Native American musicians in places that maybe you wouldn't expect just because it's the Wide West, the open prairie, something like that. It's not an attack scene, so trying to undo it by putting them in places where it's just depictions of Wyoming.
Professor Gutso compiled music sources that would later be fully scored for orchestral strings and piano by Boulder Symphony arranger John Clay Allen and music director Devin Hughes.
These days, if John Williams were to write a score, that would be perfectly synced with every single, down to the millisecond, not just beats and minutes of the film. And in this kind of music, in 1923, this is going to be generally played with a pianist who has some tunes, a local pianist. It wouldn't be a pianist probably traveling with the film, that would have tunes that could be improvised on, that could be repeated, that could essentially be played, for 2.5 hours or however long the film was. So to recreate a film like this in 2023, we took Ann Guzzo and John Clay Allen. They kind of put the music together. A lot of the tunes had already been created. And Clay, our composer in residence, kind of put together based on, where different themes should show up in the film.
The Northern Arapaho Eagle Society drum and singers, led by Michael Ridgebear, performed their traditional songs, intercut with the orchestra.
I'm responsible for our social and ceremonial songs that I keep the drum for that society. And so we've been asked to participate in this redo the old silent film, which I have relatives who acted in my great-grandfather, his name was Wes Shakespeare, and he was one of the Arapahos that traveled to Utah and Nevada.
The contemporary Arapaho Redux soundtrack was recorded in front of a live audience at the Pine Street Church in Boulder, Colorado, during Indigenous Peoples Month on October 14, 2023. "100 years earlier, the Covered Wagon director James Cruz enlisted the services of Lander, Wyoming rancher Ed Farlow and future cowboy movie star Tim McCoy to hire tribal members as background actors, rather than Filipino, Latino, or white actors in makeup. At the time, both Farlow and McCoy were living near Lander, a Wind River Reservation border town in west-central Wyoming. They recruited a few hundred tribal members, mostly Arapaho, to be covered wagon background actors. McCoy and Farlow traveled with their cast members to Utah for the production. The tribal members were fairly compensated each day. $5 per adult, 50 cents per child, $1 for each horse, and $1 per teepee, in addition to transportation and meals. Crews also hired hundreds of covered wagons at the rate of $2 per day to be in the movie. The wagon owner families were also extras in the film. There was a huge herd of bison that was included in a stampede scene. Seven bison were killed during the movie filming. Tribal members, in full regalia, provided an onstage prologue before each covered wagon major screening beginning in 1923 called Pioneer Days, to add context to the epic Western movie. During the prologue, each tribal member used sign language to tell their story, which was translated by McCoy.
Yes, time now for the real McCoy, Tim McCoy.
You know, this sign language of the Plains Indians is very interesting because you can talk to all the Plains tribes, and they'll all understand these same signs. So the sun, the moon, and the stars didn't exist.
Similarly, the covered wagon Redux will open with this documentary prologue, focused on Colorado. People seeing the beauty of this valley will want to stay, and their staying will be the undoing of the beauty. According to local folklore, the quote is attributed to Arapaho Chief Nawat. It is true that Nawat peacefully asked a group of miners to abide by the 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty and look elsewhere for gold so as to protect the Arapaho winter camp in what is now the Boulder Valley of Colorado. His request fell on deaf ears. As more tribal land was spoiled and taken for the good of the expanding western frontier, the United States government constructed military outposts to protect settlers from attacks by Native Americans, who were portrayed as evil savages. Policies glorified westward expansion and facilitated the taking of pristine lands by force. Tribal life began to diminish with western expansion into the Arapaho homeland, facilitated by two businessmen, Charles Bent and Saron St. Vrain, who formed the Bent, St. Vrain and Company. They built a fort on the northeastern plains of Colorado at the confluence of the South Platte River and a tributary now called St. Vrain Creek in 1830. The outpost was a place where tribal members could also barter their animal hides for supplies. In the fall of 1858, a party of gold prospectors led by Captain Thomas Aikens, after a stop at Fort St. Vrain, trekked 30 miles west, toward Nederland, above Boulder, seeking precious metals. The party pitched camp at Boulder Creek, near a rock formation called Valmont Butte, east of what is now Boulder. Chief Nawat galloped down to greet them when he peacefully asked the miners to look elsewhere for gold. Nawat threatened war, but the miners and the U.S. Army stood firm. There continued to be tension. The Arapaho engaged in retaliatory battles provoked by settlers, but Nawat relented, thinking that coexisting with the interlopers was the only solution that would result in the Boulder Valley remaining undisturbed. Customary tribal life that had endured for centuries before came to an abrupt halt after the U.S. Army ambushed an Arapaho and Cheyenne encampment that became known as the Sand Creek Massacre. Movies like The Covered Wagon romanticized settlers traveling west with stops at military posts like Fort St. Vrain, with the U.S. Army providing protection along the way. Shortly after Captain Aiken's party was allowed to prospect for gold, pioneers began to provoke the Arapaho, who responded in kind to protect their dwindling territory. The Colorado territorial government took steps to address the conflicts among settlers and the Arapaho. Newspaper accounts about attacks by tribes struck fear in Boulder. The townspeople built an earthen fort east of town, later known as Fort Chambers. One notable pioneer was David Nichols. He came to the Boulder gold mining boomtown in 1859 and set up shop as a blacksmith. His granddaughter, Lora Webb, later recounted that her grandfather held racist views toward Native Americans, which may have been his motivation to become Boulder County Sheriff. Lora kept a detailed diary that provides insight into her grandfather's perspective about Native Americans. She writes,
"His experiences with the noble red man very understandably prejudiced him against them. Many a time I heard my grandfather say emphatically, 'The only good Indian is a dead Indian.' I do not like to remember the anecdotes they told about the Indian atrocities which were too awful to bear contemplation. Although I have often heard him say when visiting with his cronies, considering the treatment the Indians received from the white men, it is no wonder they show no mercy. I separated from my grandfather's experiences and prejudices and turned my creative pursuits to photography. Grandfather fought 4 battles with the Indians, one of them being that of Sand Creek, which will be remembered as the most sanguinary engagement."
Territorial Governor John Evans formed the Colorado 3rd Volunteer Cavalry in 1864 to punish the tribes, viewed as hostile, and to force them out of the Colorado Territory. Nichols later resigned as sheriff to accept a captain's commission with Company D of the Colorado 3rd. Cheyenne Chief One Eye negotiated a truce between the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and the U.S. government. According to the agreement, tribal members would be guaranteed safe winter camping along the nearby Sand Creek. Despite the pact, on November 29, 1864, around 750 Arapaho and Cheyenne people, in compliance with the U.S. Army orders, were peacefully encamped along Sand Creek in southeastern Colorado. The camp was surprise attacked by the Colorado 3rd, under the command of Colonel John Chivington. The helpless tribal members waved American and white flags as soldiers stormed the camp. After the attack, more than 150 tribal members, mostly women and children, were dead, and their bodies mutilated. The 650 troops included the 100 volunteers of Company D, who were trained at Fort Chambers under the command of Captain Nichols. The fort was located on the outskirts of Boulder, and very near to where Chief Nawat confronted the original party of miners heading to Netherlands 6 years earlier. After several investigations, the massacre was admonished and resulted in the Treaty of the Little Arkansas in 1865. It was soon reneged upon, with the U.S. government taking back 90% of the Cheyenne and Arapaho reservation lands. Following the Sand Creek Massacre and expulsion from Colorado, the conquered tribes were divided and dispersed to other reservations. The Southern Arapaho and Cheyenne ended up in Oklahoma. The Northern Cheyenne tribe is now in Montana. The Arapaho tribe, because of its involvement with the Covered Wagon, is the focus of Arapaho Days. The Northern Arapaho were banished from their traditional homeland in northern Colorado. Eastern Shoshone Chief Washakie eventually allowed the Northern Arapaho to temporarily stay in Shoshone Territory, what later became the Wind River Reservation. New beginnings for a culture that straddles 2 worldviews starts with introducing students to activities like this traditional bison ceremony.
it's a really important day today for all of us to be part of this activity here. It's not just another thing. It's something you should really pay attention to and respect. Respect Dickie John and his elder ways. And National Geographic was there and took pictures. So if you look in National Geographic back in 94, 95, you should see the same thing happening over there at Blue Sky.
This is my first buffalo.
Southern Arapaho tribal legislator and cultural advocate Billie Sutton says, preservation of the Arapaho language is important to maintain cultural traditions.
Our own kids need to get together and do it again. I want to see North and South back together again. We've been apart so long we've lost track of who our families are.
Teresa Hischase is a member of the Northern Arapaho Business Council and organized the Language and Culture Camp.
In 2018, we began the planning stages of the Estes Park Language Camp, and then the pandemic hit, and so we put it off for a few years. And so this year, May 30th through June 4th is when we finally got to go down for our Estes Park Language Camp. We took 11 students from the reservation, 3 college students from CWC and Haskell. We learned where our people used to camp, different places where the elders used to harvest medicinal plants, the names of all of the mountaintops, the names of the rivers in Arapaho language, as well as historical content. And it was just really amazing because we felt a spiritual presence, and we believe that our ancestors were with us.
The Southern and Northern Arapaho are still culturally tied together by language and spirituality, with frequent travel, mostly by the Southern Arapaho, who transport themselves to Wyoming and back to Oklahoma. Arapaho people practice tribal ceremonies, like sweat lodges, and want to re-establish their ways on repatriated homelands and reverse intentional cultural disruptions. Over the past few decades, there have been some cultural activities in Boulder as attempts to forge stronger relations between the Arapaho and the Boulder Valley communities. Recently, the tribes have developed support from the wider community by forging relationships with local organizations, such as Right Relationship Boulder, which successfully worked with the Boulder City Council to establish Indigenous Peoples Day as a replacement for Columbus Day.
Whereas Indigenous people in Boulder have, as in all parts of the Americas, endured centuries of cruelty, exploitation, and genocide. Now, therefore, be it resolved by the City Council of Boulder, the second Monday in October of each year to be Indigenous Peoples Day.
The Boulder Valley School District is adapting its curriculum to place more emphasis on the tribal presence in the area.
This was an amazing event today here at Casey Middle School, where Casey was able to invite members and guests of the Arapaho tribes, Northern and Southern, to their building to at least have a single event like this for one day, but also to build the relationships, to begin to understand how we can better improve what we have in our curriculum and our curricular resources to help educate the students in Boulder Valley about Native people and about the Arapaho people too.
Before we started learning about the Arapaho, we had to do an activity of Native Americans, And I got really interested in the Arapaho for their beadwork, so that really got me into the Arapaho. I was with 2 women here who are sisters, and they were talking about their beadwork and the meanings behind their beadwork. And they were also talking about their stories of their grandparents and how it's been passed down through generations, and I found it all really interesting.
The results of this ongoing relationship filter down from tribal elders to the community at large, and are intended to reverse negative stereotyping by replacing incomplete and inaccurate stories with those about how tribal members live today. An example of this, Arapaho elder Wayne Seahair led an Arapaho language workshop at a recent Indigenous Peoples Day event at Boulder High School.
I am Vaishnav. So I said, Nanane no, hustle no, okay. You say, Nanane no? Your name? Ingrid. Nanane no?
And.
Undoing negative stereotypes is a daunting task that begins with students.
I wish that everybody could understand more of the history of the Arapaho and many more Native American tribes, because they all have a really interesting story and it's something that we people should know about so that history doesn't get lost and that there's no more racism.
Movies like The Covered Wagon depicted Indians as casualties of war rather than as victims of genocide. Ironically, Cruise's production perpetuated the stereotypes he wanted to avoid. Elders recounted stories about going into the border towns of Lander and Riverton and being confronted by signs like white only or no dogs or Indians allowed.
Especially in the bars, even restaurants. It's like that Jim Crow scene, you know. My dad took me to town when I was a little kid, and there was a drive-in, you know, right by the old high school where they tore it down. And we couldn't go in. Instead, we had to park out in the back, and my dad had a lady come out and took the order. We couldn't go inside.
But back in our day, we were always told to be careful when you go to town. And guys are powerful people, you know. We're just small people. They tell us that. My parents tell us that. So I grew up that way, you know. My grandpa said, hey, you better be careful when you go to town. Dangerous over there for you, they say. You might get hurt.
Right Relationship Boulder and tribal elders have been working together with the city government to figure out a way to repatriate parkland back to the Arapaho tribe. The Chambers property, east of Boulder, is a potential site that was acquired by the City of Boulder Open Space Department, which leased the land to a private rancher who pastures cattle. Elvin Kenrick, a southern Arapaho chief, thinks that giving access to the land base is key to improving relations with the Boulder Valley.
Because of that stone indicating Fort Chambers, there's land that has already been purchased from the city of Boulder. And the whole thing is to educate our community and to unite not only the local people in this community, but unite them with the Arapaho people. Interact with the people, teach the people, share the lives of this community, of what was here before, who was here before.
Boulder was a place where they picked choke cherries. There was a lot of choke cherries there. He called it Bibinotina. That's the name of it in Arapaho. Bibinotina, where you pick choke cherries. Bibinotina, that's the name of Boulder. Around that area, he said, he was telling me about where there was some kind of militia there, he said. It wasn't cavalry. He said they were the ones that actually had done a Sand Creek massacre there.
So our stories, our oral stories, go back to times when everybody spoke Arapaho, the people and the animals. A magpie came close by, and then the elders were talking to each other in Arapaho, and then it came closer.
The covered wagon Redux, Arapaho Days, provides a safe space for diverse and collaborative voices to change perceptions and reverse negative stereotypes in support of the Arapaho people. There are Arapaho stories about the tribe returning to their traditional homelands in northern Colorado.
Down there we're whole. We had our own way. We done things our own way down in Boulder, on the Estes part of that area.
The elders in Arapaho, they were saying, "Haniye no habethen," and I'm glad you came. And then the magpie was making little chirping noises and saying things back while he was looking at him. And so that was just a good reminder for everybody that the animals still know and understand our language.
We'll make our way back down where we belong sometimes, he said. That was his wish anyway, maybe he thought that way. I said, Grandpa, we're gonna stay here forever. I said, no, we're not. I said, you watch, he said. So that area down there is supposed to be where we belong.
With broad community support, the Arapaho homecoming may happen sooner than later. Enjoy the Arapaho Covered Wagon Redux, featuring the Northern Arapaho Eagle Society under the leadership of Michael Ridgebear, and the Boulder Symphony, directed by Devin Hughes.